What's up? Jeff from Retro Arcade Gaming on YouTube. Today, I'm going to revisit one of my earliest port battles, no longer on the site. It was one of the first ones that I ever did, and quite frankly, wasn't that good. I rambled through gameplay, had a crappy microphone, so it's time to give it its proper treatment. I've also added a few more ports that weren't included in the original. If you need a reminder, in this series I take a look at a specific arcade game, how well or poorly it's been ported to various console and computer systems over the years. Up this week, perhaps the original quarter sucker, known as Rampage, which was developed and released by Bally Midway in 1986. I believe the original port battle only had about 8 ports. Today, we upped that number to 20, 21, something in that number. I'll be the first to admit, I'm not very good at Rampage. I think that was the whole point. I read an article once that indicated the average gameplay time on Rampage was 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Of course, it did offer you the option to continue for an additional quarter. If you played for an hour with an average game time of 3 minutes, you would have poured in $5. If my math is right. I'm not very good at math. There isn't any background music or really fancy sound effects, so there's not a whole lot of comparison or contrasting these ports other than how do they look? How do they sound? In a very basic way. The gameplay is simple. You've been transformed into a rampaging monster by an experimental pill. You can play the game as one of 3 characters, at least in the arcade version. George, who bears a strong resemblance to King Kong, Lizzie, who bears a strong resemblance to Godzilla, or Ralph, who bears a strong resemblance to a giant werewolf, I guess. Interestingly enough, the arcade version starts off in Peoria, Illinois, which is actually my birthplace and the town I grew up in. The goal is simple. Destroy the buildings before the National Guardsmen destroy you. You can pick up various power-ups along the way. Just be careful because some of them are actually harmful. 2 friends could join you for 3-player fun, which did extend the gameplay just a bit. As usual, we'll start our tour with a look at the original arcade game via MAME. The Atari 2600 port, released in 1986 by Activision, sorry I can't help but laugh at this one, is quite frankly a steaming pile of trash. In 86, the great video game crash had occurred, and the 2600 was essentially a budget gaming console being sold for about $50. Developers and publishers had long figured out tricks for the 2600 to at least make games presentable. While the title screen and city skyline look okay, gameplay is where this one falls short. Graphics are crude, sounds are flat, the one-button control of the 2600 makes gameplay difficult, as the game is meant to be played with separate jump and punch buttons. To jump, you aren't supposed to push in a direction and press fire. The monster is supposed to leap in the direction he is facing. It's very easy to jump when you intend to punch, and punch when you intend to jump. Rants aside, here's Rampage for the Atari 2600. Two versions were released in 1987 for the Commodore 64, a US version and a European release. They share similar gameplay and sounds, but I'll give the US version a nod in the graphics category. Sounds are very good. The port doesn't really seem to care what city you're in, as it never really gives a city name. Again, provided you have enough joysticks and keyboards, you can play with all three monsters. Here's the US version for Commodore 64. Here's a quick look at the very similar, if not graphically inferior, in my opinion, Commodore 64 port released in Europe. The Atari ST got a Rampage port in '87, again by Activision. Looks pretty good, has decent sounds. You can set the other characters to inactive to avoid having them on the screen, which is very nice. The Atari 8-bit family got a release by Activision in '87. Wish I could comment on this one, but I could not get it to run properly. It either glitched graphically or I couldn't get the controllers to work. So I've got no real comments on this one. You get to look at stitched together captures of a few of the demo screens. The Nintendo Entertainment System port, released by Data East in 1988. The NES only allows 2-player control, so Data East decided to omit Ralph and allow you to select either George or Lizzie. I'm not sure why you couldn't select for any of the three, but that's a decision that Data East made. They also decided that the game should start in San Jose, California. But on the plus side, we do have a dedicated jump and punch buttons. If you're playing single player, only your character is visible on the screen. Graphically, it's okay, not outstanding. I'm not a huge fan of the background music. Sounds are decent. It just feels sluggish to me, not real fluid. It's something that doesn't really translate via video, but you'd notice it if you were playing it in person. Activision released a port for MS-DOS in '88. This one has the option of four-color CGA graphics or 16-color EGA graphics, and is a fair representation of the original arcade game. The sounds, unfortunately, come from the PC speaker, and that's always a bit of a disappointment. It also suffers from the same single-button jump punch configuration as the 2600, at least defaulted. In theory, if you had three joysticks or a huge keyboard, you and two friends could play with all three monsters simultaneous. It's really a decent port by MS-DOS standards. First, here's a look at the CGA version. Up next, we'll look at the 16-color EGA version of that same release. Activision also released a port of Rampage for the ZX Spectrum in 1988. Really, the sounds are non-existent, but for a Spectrum port, this one isn't too bad. You get your choice of all three characters, but no real option to just play solo if you want. The other two will always be playing as a computer player, but it's possible I missed a setting and you can actually set them to inactive. Check on that if you're a ZX Spectrum fan. The Amstrad Color PC got a port, again by Activision in 1988. Looks decent graphically, colorful, that's for sure. Again, not a big fan of the background music, but overall, this one is not a bad play. So this next one is the Activision port for the Apple II, released in '88. It looks okay for the most part. I had some issues with gameplay. It would crawl to a stop almost when the action got busy on the screen. The joystick really unresponsible. I'm going to chalk that up more to emulation than actually playing it on real hardware. But if your experience differs, let me know. The Amiga got a port in '89. It's similar to the Commodore 65 titles in terms of gameplay. Graphics are stepped up a notch or two. Much cleaner appearance, specifically the monsters. Sounds are an improvement, much more clear and concise. Again, if you have the room and enough controllers, 3 players can play the game at once. And as far as I can tell, if the monsters aren't being played, they just sit there. Although, there is the option to make them inactive, which I didn't notice until after I played. As a bonus, if you don't set them to inactive and they just sit there, you can punch them if it makes you feel any better. The 1989 Sega Master System released by Activision is probably as good as it's going to get on a console. While still a 2-player game, you can select from any of the 3 original characters. It's got dedicated jump and punch buttons and looks a little more polished than the NES version, in my opinion. Still got background music, which I'm not a huge fan of, and my hometown is disrespected as this one starts off in San Francisco. No love for Peoria, I guess. The Atari 7800 got a port by Activision in 1989. Pretty crude graphics on this one. not so great sound. Mediocre port for the 7800. So to expand on that a little bit, Kevin Moss 3 posted publicly on the Atari Age forums about his graphical update of Rampage for the Atari 7800. As far as I know, it was a prototype only, saw a limited release on cartridge to a very small number of people. I don't have access to a release, so I'll post a link in the description to the No Swear Gamers YouTube page where he highlights the differences between the original and Kevin's update. Overall, Kevin's update adds more vibrant colors and a ton more detail to the game. Moving on, the TRS-80 color computer got a Rampage port in 1989. Also, again, released by Activision. This does require a color computer 3. I was actually surprised by this one. Most of the games I've looked at for the Coco were released in the early 80s. This one came out quite later. Excellent graphics and sounds. It's really a very nice play on the Coco 3. Atari took an interesting approach with their 1999 release for the Atari Lynx. For starters, they added a fourth character, Larry the Giant Rat. Why? I have no frickin' idea. What's interesting is how the game is presented. The Lynx have fairly small screen at 3.5 inches diagonal. Atari decided that a full view of the city wouldn't play well at that scale, so they decided to zoom in on the action. You can't see the top of buildings. There are usually additional buildings to the left or right of your location. I'm not a big fan of zoomed games. There's a couple other games that I play that take this approach. Miss Pac-Man comes to mind, and I'm really not a big fan of it. However, in this case, I think it plays out well. This is a fun game to play, although it's sometimes difficult to get your bearings as to where you are and where everything is at. Sounds are decent, and really it's just fun to play. The PlayStation, or PS1, got a port of Rampage in 1999 via the Arcade Party Pack compilation. This was published by Midway Games, also features 720 clacks, Smash TV, Super Sprint, and Tubin. It's basically a straight-up emulation of the arcade game. Another emulated title, Digital Eclipse, released a title called Midway Arcade Treasures for the GameCube, Xbox, PlayStation 2, and Windows PCs in 2003. One of the feature titles is Rampage. It is as close as you're going to get to playing Rampage on a console since it's emulated. Today we're going to take a look at the PlayStation 2 variant of this game. The Game Boy Advance got a Rampage port in 2005 in the form of a 2-pack, also featuring the Atari game Paperboy. It was published by Destination Software in the US and Zoo Digital Publishing in Europe. Overall, it looks okay. Very lackluster sounds. PlayStation Portable got a release of Rampage via the compilation titled Midway Arcade Treasures Extended Play. Released by Midway in 2005, this featured 21 Midway arcade classics, including 720, Arch Rivals, Championship Sprint, Cyberball 2072, Defender, Gauntlet, Joust, Clax, Marble Madness, Mortal Kombat 1, 2, and 3, Paperboy, Sinister, Spy Hunter, Tubin, Wizards of War, Xenophobe, and Zybots. It's a straight-up emulation of the actual arcade game. The PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and later Xbox One via backwards compatibility got a release of Rampage via the Midway Arcade Origins compilation, released by Warner Brothers Interactive in 2012. Features 31 Midway arcade classics, including 720, APB, Arch Rivals, Bubbles, Championship Sprint, Defender, Defender 2, Gauntlet, Gauntlet 2, Joust, Joust 2, Marble Madness, Pit Fighter, Rampart, Robotron 2084, Root Beer Tapper, Satan's Hollow, Sinistar, Smash TV, Spy Hunter 2, Super Off-Road, Super Sprint, Tubin, Total Carnage, Tournament Cyberball 2072, Vindicators Part 2, Wizards of War, Xenophobe, and Zybots. Again, straight up emulation of the actual arcade game. wraps up our remastered look at Rampage ports, including 13 or 14 new variants. If you like the work I'm doing here, hit that like and subscribe button. Tell your friends about me. I've got a few more remastered port battles to focus on. Then we'll move on to some new titles, continue our best of lists for other consoles and games. That's all for now. Until next time, happy gaming. Peace.